Hello, everyone. My name is Bill Armeline, and I am the director of the San Jose State University Human Rights Institute. I'd like to welcome you to the 2022 Annual Human Rights Lecture Series. The point of this series is to bring together critical decision makers, community stakeholders, scholars, and students to analyze our most pressing human rights crises and their potential solutions. Given the official end of the formal US war in Afghanistan and Russian invasion of Ukraine, this year's series is focused on the dangers of American militarism and nuclear weapons proliferation. In 2020, the US spent more, that's $778 billion, on its military than the next 11 countries combined. That's 39% of total military spending in the world and nearly double what the US spent in 2001. In the same year, the Bulletin of the atomic scientists warned that the world is closer to a nuclear apocalypse than ever in history, and the chances for such a conflict will increase in connection to the resource and human migratory implications of climate change. Today, these warnings have become even more dire. Devastating humanitarian disasters continue in Yemen and Afghanistan in the wake of war. Technological and military competition between the US and China continues to increase with no end in sight. And the Russian invasion of Ukraine forces us to grapple with the existential crisis of a nuclear conflict. As we face overlapping threats to human survival, how can we rethink the US approach to achieving global peace and security? How else should American resources and influence be used? How can everyday people challenge the kind of military spending and interventionism that continue to define American foreign policy? Our star-studded panel and moderator will lead us in a discussion of these questions and more today. So a couple housekeeping notes quickly before we get moving with our land acknowledgement and introduction of our guests. So we'll begin with comments from each of our panelists on their analysis of American defense spending and approach to national security and of potential alternatives. Audience members are encouraged to submit questions to our panelists via the Q&A function. At 4:15, we'll transition to the discussion portion where panelists will respond to audience questions in what should be a lively and robust conversation. We will end this evening's event with some closing remarks near 5 o'clock. That said, the conversation will continue with a follow-up event this coming Friday on the 18th at 3 o'clock Pacific time on understanding the growing danger of nuclear weapons, featuring astrophysics professor from Princeton University, Stuart Prager, and our own professor, Curtis Asplund, both from the Physics Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction. Please see the posted link and flyer to register now. We'll have that posted throughout the event. And now I would like to introduce one of the HRI student interns, Ariana Shah, who will give our land acknowledgement for today.
We would like to begin this program by recognizing that while we gather at San Jose State University, we are gathered on the ethno-historic tribal territory of the Thamian Ohlone, who are the direct ancestors of the lineages enrolled in the Mawaka Ohlone tribe and who were missionized into Mission Santa Clara, San Jose, and Dolores. The lands on which San Jose State University is established was and continues to be of significance to the Mawaka Ohlone tribe. We also recognize that the ancestors of the Mawaka Ohlone constructed and maintained the 3 Bay Area missions. Our campus extends to surrounding areas that held a tupintak, a traditional roundhouse, which was once located at the historic Lo P. Inigo land grant rancho, Pozo Mi y Pozo Tidas las Animas, and also Marcelo Pio and Cristobal's land grant rancho, Olistac, which were places of celebration and religious ceremonies, as well as nearby ancestral heritage shell mounds that served as the tribe's traditional cemetery sites and territorial monuments. San Jose State University also desires to honor the military service of the Mawaka men and women who have honorably served overseas during World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, and Iraq, and who are still serving in the United States Armed Forces today.
Okay, so next I would like to introduce our moderator for today. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce our moderator for this afternoon, SJSU HRI Journalism Coordinator Halima Kazam Stojanovic. Halima is an investigative journalist and filmmaker and a lecturer in journalism and human rights at San Jose State University. She is the journalism coordinator and a core faculty member of the SJSU Human Rights Institute. Her PhD research is a feminist history of gender, empire, and resistance in Afghanistan, and is informed by more than 20 years of working as a journalist, including a decade of reporting on the war and rebuilding efforts in Afghanistan. Halima's articles have been published in the Los Angeles Times, The Guardian, the San Francisco Chronicle, Al Jazeera, and the Christian Science Monitor. She worked as a human rights researcher for Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, and as a journalism instructor for the Institute for War and Peace Reporting. From 2002 to 2014, she trained more than 300 journalists in Afghanistan. She is the co-producer of a documentary by Frontrunner, chronicling the campaign of the first female presidential candidate in Afghanistan. And with that, I will turn it over to Halima to introduce our first panelist.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Ariana, for that. So we've got a great event for you today to start off our conversation with some context, data, and critical scholarship on U.S. defense spending and the implications of the war on terror. We'd like to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Netta Crawford. Dr. Crawford is a professor and chair of the Department of Political Science at Boston University. She is the author of more than 24 peer-reviewed articles on issues of war and peace, and the author of 3 books, Soviet Military Aircraft, Argument and Change in World Politics, named Best Book in International History and Politics by the American Political Science Association, and Accountability for Killing, Moral Responsibility for America's Post-9/11 Wars. Dr. Crawford has served on the governing boards of the American Political Science Association and of the Academic Council of the United Nations System. She is currently a co-director of the Costs of War Project based at Brown and Boston Universities. She is a member of the board of the Council for Livable World and the editorial board of several academic journals. In 2018, the International Ethics section of the International Studies Association gave Dr. Crawford a Distinguished Scholar Award. As of July 2022, she will be the Montague Burton Professor at Oxford University in the UK. Dr. Crawford?
Well, thank you. It is a pleasure to be with you today, my evening, your afternoon. And I just wanted to take the opportunity to also appreciate the land, and actually the acknowledgement is linked to the theme of militarism in the sense that the land was not given, it was taken. And any taking of the land, either by brute force or through economic coercion, reflects the sort of theme of American expansion through in line with militarized beliefs. So what I want to do today is talk not just about American militarism, but the phenomenon of militarism. And I'm a scholar of war and peace. So as a nerd, I'm going to do what academics typically do, which is try to clarify a few concepts, and especially those that are sometimes difficult to pin down, add some data, and suggest ways to move beyond militarism and militarization. So first, I thought it'd be useful to define militarism and its close cousin, military preparedness. Military preparedness, or what some call the military way, stresses the subordination of military power to political purpose and believes that brute force has its limits. In fact, brute force can sometimes be counterproductive. That's the military way, that's military preparedness. Militarism, on the other hand, is a different beast. We tend to think of European and American militarism as a new phenomenon. In fact, Andy Bacevich, who was a colleague of mine at Boston University, argues that military force and military preparedness have their role, but he suggests that sometimes Americans go too far. He says, quote, "Americans in our own time have fallen prey to militarism, manifesting itself in a romanticized view of soldiers, a tendency to see military power as the truest measure of national greatness, and outsized expectations regarding military force, the efficacy of force. To a degree," he says, "without precedent in US history, Americans have come to define the nation's strength and well-being in terms of military preparedness, military action and the fostering of or nostalgia for military ideals, end quote. But of course, militarism is an old concern. Historians highlight the role of militarist beliefs, and in particular, how they played into the outbreak of World War I and World War II. Some argued, in fact, for many years, that German culture at the time was particularly militaristic. I argue that militarism is a collection of beliefs that can infuse decision-making. So it's an ideology. It's a belief that military force is usually or always the best option when confronting threats. Threats to non-military values will be understood to demand a military response. In fact, it tends to see, the militarist ideology tends to see economic or political challenges or differences as potential military threats, and the solution to many problems, it argues, can be found through military institutions and the use of force. To be more specific, I'm going to name very specific beliefs that are associated with militarism and talk a little bit about the process of militarization, which is mobilizing to use military force and mobilizing beliefs. So the first one is that others are hostile. They hate you and what you stand for. Second, it's a belief that security is a scarce resource. If the other side acts to increase its security, thereby definition making you more insecure. So militarists are reluctant to see conciliation in the other's behavior or how their own actions may have made others feel humiliated, encircled, or insecure. They ignore what social scientists call the security dilemma, how actions that are meant to make you more secure can in fact be seen as aggressive by the other side. So your armament is seen, even if it's a defensive armament, is seen as aggressive. So they're always focusing on the threatening potential of the adversary. And that's not to say that an adversary could not be threatening, but it's ignoring one's own role in that dynamic. Third, militarists overvalue the utility and controllability of military force. They believe that force is useful and safe. In other words, militarists believe that war is effective, often efficient, and that risks of escalation and unintended consequences are low. Militarists tend to think conquest is easy, that adversaries will not resist, or that they will collapse with just the right amount of pressure, that the civilians of the land they conquer will greet them as liberators, and that war, including the potential for escalation, can and will be controlled. So, fourth, militarists exaggerate the advantages of preemptive war and first strikes. And related to that, they exaggerate windows of opportunity and vulnerability. So this is the belief that if you don't act now, all will be lost. Fifth, militarists value conquests. And in particular, they believe that the value of what they gain in a conquest is high. And they believe that resources are cumulative, and they exaggerate the value of the international gains that they may make in terms of territory and the importance of wide spheres of influence. The thing is, and this is sixth, there are sometimes actual threats out there, but militarists not only exaggerate the utility of military force, they devalue other ways of dealing with those threats. So non-military tools are undervalued. Diplomacy and sanctions are believed to be either or both ineffective or too slow. This is what C. Wright Mills called a military definition of the situation. Seventh, in a militarized society, war and soldiers are glorified, giving soldiers an outsized role in foreign policy decision-making. Leaders and the news media also tend to put a premium on military expertise. Militarists emphasize as well the need for secrecy and speed. Eighth, while militarists often evince wartime optimism about the capacity to win their objectives, militarists often engage in what is called peacetime pessimism about their capabilities, saying that they need more resources, that they're not up to the task, that the other, even no matter how much you spend, is still a military challenge. So in this sense, militarists are emphasizing the worst case scenario, and they are overemphasizing the other's potential successful use of force. They're undervaluing their own capabilities and overestimating the other. This is both conscious and unconscious threat inflation. It's sometimes used to get larger budgets. Ninth, the economic benefits of military spending are exaggerated by militarists, and the economic costs of military spending and war are minimized. And then finally, 10th, before wars begin, the human and environmental costs and consequences of war are forgotten or minimized. So militarists tend to forget or don't mention that wars don't end for soldiers and civilians when the fighting stops. Veterans, of course, must be provided for many decades, but this often isn't included if there is an estimate of the economic costs of wars, nor is it often in the mention of the civilian and that is the families of the soldiers, the civilian costs of wars at home. Further, destruction and fire release in wars a toxic miasma of dust, lead, asbestos, and in some cases radioactivity. So the environmental costs are sometimes minimized or erased entirely. In fact, we've only recently begun to grapple with the greenhouse gas emissions associated with large military forces and war. The US military is the United States' single largest energy user and its single largest greenhouse gas emitter. In fact, it is the world's single largest greenhouse gas emitter. Its emissions are on par with medium-sized countries like Denmark and Sweden and Portugal. So what I'm suggesting, and should be clear from what I'm saying, is that you can see many of the militarist beliefs that I've outlined at work in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But we must also recall that they were on display in the post-9/11 wars. We were told in 2001 and 2003 that war was the only option, that other tools could not work to prevent terrorism or they would be too slow, that the wars, especially in Iraq, would be quick, and the US would be greeted as liberators. And indeed, we were assured that the military could rebuild Iraq and Afghanistan and turn them into democracies, and that democracy would ripple through the Middle East. So these militarist beliefs know no borders. They belong to the world. Which brings me to my second point about when I talked about how democracies would be a necessary, in fact, consequence of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. I want to underscore a very important relationship between militarism and war on the one hand, and democracy on the other. We sometimes hear it said that World War II got the US out of the Great Depression and led to more women being employed, and that the military was a leader in racial integration in the United States. But I think we have to look at the other side of this equation. War and democracy don't go well together. In fact, they are normative opposites. War says force is useful and indeed right. Might makes right. It denies the other side their say and their literal voice when it kills the adversary. Democracy says that we must take force off the table and resolve our disputes nonviolently. It puts a premium on deliberation and negotiation. The thing is that the attitudes about war abroad sometimes leak into attitudes about the utility and value of democracy at home. In war, information and decision-making power is concentrated. Legislatures are sidelined in the name of secrecy and speed, and the news media are told what to print and when they can print it. Again, this isn't a malady that's unique to this particular country. Public dissent is often deliberately silenced by laws about what can be said, and people self-censor because they are afraid of seeming unpatriotic. Further, when people are fearful, they tend to focus on threats and don't think how their actions might be perceived as threatening. War tends to be associated not only with patriotism, but with an intolerant form of nationalism, and it can increase domestic racism. So, in sum, wars and militarism are toxic to democracies. So, in American political life, there is a tradition of cautioning against the effect of militarism. James Madison said in 1787, "A standing military force with an overgrown executive will not long be safe companions to liberty. The means of defense against foreign danger," he said, "have been always the instruments of tyranny at home. Among the Romans," Madison argued, "it was a standing maxim to excite a war whenever a revolt was apprehended. Throughout all Europe," he says, "the armies kept up under the pretext of defending have enslaved the people." Madison also said, of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. War is the parent, he says, of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes, and debts and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few. He says, in war, too, the discretionary power of the executive is extended. Its influence in dealing out offices, honors, and emoluments is multiplied, and all the means of seducing the minds are added to those of subduing the force of the people. There is also, he says, an inequality of fortunes and the opportunities of fraud growing out of a state of war and democracy. A state of war and degeneracy of manners and of morals. No nation would preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. So this might sound like Eisenhower, but of course it's 150 years before then. Similarly, George Washington, in his farewell address in 1796, urged Americans to protect their union and to, quote, avoid the necessity of those overgrown military establishments which, under any form of government, are inauspicious to liberty and which are to be regarded as particularly hostile to Republican liberty. So some were so concerned that no one had listened to Madison and Washington that this question about militarization came up after the Civil War. In 1875, Congressman Henry Slocum, who was a Civil War veteran, implied an unhealthy level of military influence in the United States when he told fellow members of Congress that we draw on the Army for our stump orders, we call on them to preside at the polls. If we desire to negotiate the purchase of an island in the sea, the negotiations must be carried on by a brigadier general. If the merchants of New York wish storage for their goods, they must go to a colonel of the staff. We can hardly pass a bill through Congress, he said, without the aid of a field officer. Now, I want to end on this note. I've said that democracy and war are antipodal to each other. They're opposites. And what we've seen, I think, is that more democracy and deliberation there is, the more war can be constrained. The more deliberation, the more likely the excesses of militarism, the excessive reliance on military force, and the outsized role that militaries and military industry sometimes play in the life of a nation can be right-sized. And there is hope for any people of a state or society that has been captured by militarist beliefs. And that's where I think we need to look to democracy.
Thank you, Dr. Crawford. A lot of points to work through in our conversation. I just want to remind our audience that to submit questions throughout the presentations so that we will get to them after our guests are done presenting. A lot to think about, the concepts of war and democracy, definitely thinking about them being normative opposites. And I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Bilal Sarwari, who is an Afghan journalist, having worked extensively with Western media, including work as a BBC reporter, covering Afghanistan since 2001, when the US-led invasion first toppled the Taliban regime. He is now an independent scholar, investigating the central linkages between warfare, drugs, and terrorism, or what he calls the FARCification of the Taliban, FARC being the revolutionary armed forces in Colombia, drawing parallels between the experiences there and what is happening in Afghanistan. Bilal, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I guess what I wanted to talk about was mostly the mistakes of the last 20 years in Afghanistan. And as you pointed out, I started my career right after the 9/11 attacks, when the American-led invasion toppled the Taliban government in 2001. And one can notice that the dependency on airstrikes from the very get-go caused a lot of civilian casualties, when we often saw weddings and funerals, or community gatherings were targeted in rural Afghanistan. Coupled with that were, the night raids and raids, often, being led by very questionable characters at a village district level, that I feel alienated the Afghan population, from the very beginning. I think it was also true that the window for a negotiated settlement with the Taliban earlier on was closed deliberately, because the Americans at that time felt a sense of revenge that they had been attacked. And then, we continued to see Afghanistan literally sliding into chaos, with the Iraq invasion. Both resources and attention was hijacked, during that time. And then we saw the Taliban emerging as a very potent insurgent group, learning from Al-Qaeda and many others, from roadside bombs to truck, suicide truck bombs, and many other weapons that they applied. And Afghanistan kind of got extremely bloody, as a war, as an insurgency, and that took a very, big toll on the Afghan population. And even if you look at the period of 2010 to 2014, when various administrations, announced, troops, being deployed to Afghanistan, and then troops were drawn from Afghanistan, it was these artificial timelines, that really created even more confusion. And one hopes that more and more focus should have been on the genuine peace process, on a negotiated settlement. Obviously, we also saw, among other mistakes, was the issue of corruption, that was tolerated by the Americans. They knew, who was corrupt in the government, who was basically creating a lot of problems, but they basically turned a blind eye. And then the last sort of 4 or 5 years, 2014 onwards, was some of the most dangerous times, because for us Afghans, it was between hope and fear. Hope, for a peace process, hope for a comprehensive and permanent ceasefire, but fear, because the front line was everywhere. Every other day in Kabul, from where I was reporting, it was very usual for us to just wake up, because the earth was rattling. We often thought it was earthquakes, which you get them in Afghanistan, but they would be this regular, series of car and truck bombs inside the city of Kabul and across much of Afghanistan, airstrikes, killing civilians, roadside bombs, killing civilians. meant that we lost count of all of those tragic and sad incidents, and many of which amounted to war crimes, from the American military bombing the MSF hospital to wedding parties or schools being bombed, or the Taliban driving a truck full of explosives into the heart of Kabul city, or the Islamic State, for example, killing newly born babies at a maternity ward and hospital in Kabul. And that unprecedented level of brutality, I felt was a very prevalent feature of the war, until obviously Kabul fell, Afghanistan fell to the Taliban in 11 days. And then we saw the footage and scenes in the news of Afghans trying to get onto airplanes, running with them, the chaotic scenes, the evacuation in the 11th hour. So I feel like if I have to look back, the two big mistakes that I can point out was definitely relying heavily on airstrikes, because how can you differentiate a civilian from a Talib from thousands of miles up in the air? And I just wanted to give you an overview of the last 20 years from my own perspective. I apologize if my thoughts are very scattered, and I would be happy to take any questions when you have them for me. Thank you.
Thank you. That puts in a lot of things in perspective, and I think I'll draw from that in a moment. I think, Bilal, you mentioned the technologies and tools of war, possibly more specific to this war on terror. By technologies and tools, militaristic technologies and tools I'm referring to, such as the airstrikes, the drones, the night raids, the roadside bombs, and various uses of these. Thank you for that. I've taken many notes to ask more about, and our audience should post questions in the Q&A box. To Dr. Crawford, so we'll start with some questions. I'll start with some questions to get us moving, and I hope that the audience will start to post so we can take questions there. Perfect. Maybe to start off with Dr. Crawford, in your view, what lessons should the American public take away from our 20 years of war in Afghanistan and elsewhere in the war on terror? What were the impacts on global peace and security, and whose interests were ultimately served?
Okay, I think that very early on, in especially the war in Iraq, the norm that one does not aggress against a country which is not posing an immediate threat to you, and this idea of preventive war being not on the table, was that preventive war, in fact, is illegitimate, not legal in international law, was challenged and broken. So that is an important norm. So in fact, Putin is arguably engaged in a preventive war. Other countries have, said that we're going to war to prevent something that might happen. And in the case of Putin, it's the aggression of the so-called Nazis that really are not large in number or don't exist at all. And in our case, it was the threat of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And then the other norm that was damaged was against regime change. And that's a long-lasting, I would say, stain on the United States, in that Iraq did not pose a direct military threat, and there was a regime change there. There was also the notion that it was the United States' right to do this. The second consequence that I'd like to highlight is not about norms, but it's more about the economic consequences, the budgetary consequences. And what you see after 20 years of war is that US military spending remained very high in the 2021, FY 2021 and FY 2022 budgets. And in fact, in the next year may go up to over 800 billion. It's more than 770 billion now. And why is it that US military spending at the end of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq remained high and in fact has gone up? Well, it's because the United States military put a lot of it increased the base budget, not just the war budget. Okay, so that the base military budget remains high, and that keeps the entire budget, not just the emergency spending, up. And I can explain why that is if people are very interested in the technical reasons for that. But in part, it was because the United States had to get people to stay and re-enlist, or just enlist in general. The wars were unpopular after 2008, and bonuses, enlistment and re-enlistment bonuses had to be put into the personnel packages as well as raises. But overall, US military spending has increased, and it's consistently over half of all discretionary spending. Okay, that's a lot. And then another set of consequences that I fear are going to be lost in history, the third thing I want to highlight, is the human toll. So hundreds of thousands of people were killed in these wars directly by bombs, bullets, fire, and millions were displaced. Some of the people who were displaced were internally displaced. Some were able to go back home, but many remain displaced. Many people are still displaced, are still refugees, still stateless, and remain in camps. Another human legacy here is, of course, the fact that when infrastructure is destroyed in war, it leads to consequences for the capacity of people to get health care. So they can't get to hospitals. Hospitals may be destroyed, as we've seen most recently, but it happened a lot. The Taliban in Afghanistan sometimes targeted healthcare professionals and hospitals. And we know that the US bombed a hospital, the MSF hospital in Afghanistan, by accident. They say that all of these things are unintended, but nevertheless, what happens is in Afghanistan, people can't get to healthcare. When they get to the healthcare, the facilities are understaffed and the medicine is lacking. In Iraq and Syria, many medical professionals left as soon as they could and did not return. So that's in the war zones. And then, of course, at home, the human toll will be with us for decades in the necessity to help veterans deal with high rates of disability. I know that's a long answer, but I think there are a lot of consequences.
Yes, no, it draws my attention to your term preventative war, which is when a state launches a military conflict to prevent another state or international actor from becoming a threat. Would you say that Afghanistan was not a preventative war, but Iraq was? How would you categorize each of those two?
No, I think arguably Afghanistan was self-defense, but it wasn't necessary. Again, the alternatives were not utilized. There were still more diplomatic alternatives. There were still other means to get the perpetrators of the 9/11 attacks that were not utilized. And the international criminal court system wasn't utilized. For various reasons. The United States is not party to the International Criminal Court. Now, if the Iraq War was a preventive war, and it was called preemption, but preemption is when somebody's actually on their way to hurt you. The aggression has begun, but not yet arrived. A preventive war is, as you say, to prevent a rising power from challenging you in the future. And preventive war is not legal.
Right, and I'm going to draw from something Bilal said earlier, that if Afghanistan wasn't a preventive war, it was a preventable war. it could have been prevented. Bilal, do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because we came full circle where you mentioned that the Taliban were left out of the conversation initially, but then we circled back to them last year and during the Trump administration.
Well, I don't think Afghans had any choice when the Americans, decided to invade Afghanistan. We would have to remember that the Taliban were toppled, but not finished. And when that happened, I remember being a translator back then, there was a genuine willingness among the file and rank of Taliban to basically go back to their villages and resume their ordinary lives. But they were not allowed to do so. They were being hunted down by people that were hired by the American military at the time. Their leadership, went back to major Pakistani cities where they got, quite clear institutional support from Pakistani military intelligence, which is well documented, which in my view was the biggest mistake. Afghanistan could have been, a country with a peace process earlier on, which would have avoided all the bloodshed, especially, when you talk about the cost in human lives, whether you talk about American soldiers, Afghan civilian soldiers, or the Taliban. And I have a feeling that the US invasion of Iraq, really hijacked the attention and resources from Afghanistan. And obviously, if you're an Afghan, you often speak to the Americans from a very painful past because of the 1980s, when the Americans were supporting the Mujahideen against the Russians. And once the Russians were defeated and they left Afghanistan, the Americans totally abandoned Afghanistan. You had a civil war, you had chaos, which led to the rise and subsequent fall of the Taliban. But I have a feeling that over the last 5-6 years, the Americans, the international community, the Taliban and the Afghan government, all of them, had a chance to make the peace process a success. The reason why the peace process failed, because major component of that process were not implemented. First, it was a withdrawal deal between the Americans and the Taliban. It wasn't a peace deal, and efforts to start a peace process really failed, among many other things that I, for example, tragically watched from Kabul was the absence of victims of the conflict on the negotiating table. So, in hindsight, if you ask me, one of the biggest lessons that we can all draw from the last 5-6 years is now to start over again that failed peace process and hopefully have a negotiated settlement in Afghanistan, because we have to remind ourselves that the Taliban took over Afghanistan militarily by force. They started attacking major cities and villages, including Kabul, which I was, in Kabul when Kabul fell, which was a surprise. And the Taliban today, as the de facto rulers, have to also do better by the Afghan people. They have to open the gates of schools for the Afghan women. They have to allow Afghan women to work. They have to really allow the Afghan media to flourish. They have to answer to the Afghan people into the world. What are they doing with nearly $1 billion of revenue that they have since they've taken over? What are they spending it on? They're not spending it on paying doctors and teachers. They're not an insurgent group anymore. And if that happens, then I feel that we would have, done Afghanistan and the humanity a big service in terms of making a peace process, an investment, instead of spending more money on another war or more money on toppling another government here and there. And I certainly feel that the Taliban have been, ruling with an iron fist, whether you talk about house-to-house search or they're beating Afghan women on the streets of Kabul. They're not doing themselves any favors, and they can't also stop, the world from knowing what is happening inside Afghanistan, because it's not the 90s. Today, everyone has a cell phone, everyone has a camera on their phone. There's the generation of citizen journalism back home, and quite tragically, Afghanistan faces the risk of mass starvation, and the Taliban will have to make sure that they can, get international recognition, that they can make sure that that does not happen in 21st century.
Thank you. I'm going to draw back to Professor Crawford on, so Bilal said, and excuse me, that earlier, and I'm going to draw from that the U.S. and international allies closed the window of negotiation for the Taliban at the beginning of the Afghan war. How do you reconcile this with your definitions of militarism by completely overlooking a legitimate peace process, by closing the negotiation and almost wanting to engage in this militarily?
I think you've answered your own question. It really was a decision that negotiations would be futile, sanctions would be too slow. It's an impatience with other tools besides military force. And I think that's characteristic of militarism, that it is seen not only as effective, but that it will be efficient, and you can accomplish something much more quickly using military force. Of course, it rarely works that way. You'll get bogged down, people resist. And that's what those who advocate the use of military force often forget. So in turning away from negotiating, even if the Taliban had not turned over Osama bin Laden and had in fact protected them, there were other ways to basically put pressure, economic pressure, political pressure on the Taliban. It would have been slow, and that's the problem. When a nation has been attacked and people are fearful and angry, their prefrontal cortexes focus on threats and look for ways to respond to those threats. The American public was not prepared, because it is so militarized, to think about other tools and to support those who were advocating other tools.
What about the costs? Would peace have been less expensive? I know you look at the costs, $780 billion for the war on terror. Giving this question to both of you, what would the costs of peace would have been? Tough question.
The cost of the war in Afghanistan was trillions. It was a couple of $1 trillion, and the same with the war in Iraq. And we're still paying for both of those conflicts with high levels of expenditures and growing expenditures for veterans. And as I said, the base budget has increased. So we've basically baked in the cost of those wars. The cost of peace, of course, would have been less expensive. Now, others might argue that the United States would have been attacked again, or that the costs of the 9/11 attack were quite high. But the cost of the 9/11 attack, according to economists, was about $250 million. Okay, maybe, the worst, $500 million. Let's say it was $1 billion. Okay, we spent many times that in Afghanistan, and so did US allies, and of course so did the Afghan people. Tens of thousands of Afghan civilians were killed, tens of thousands of Afghan military and police were killed, tens of thousands of Taliban were killed. Everybody has a family. It's utter devastation. In response to the deaths of 3,000 Americans, it was a disproportionate and angry response from a wounded power. And it is more than unfortunate. And I hope I've answered your question there.
Yes, thank you. Well, John, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I think if we had invested in a peace process earlier on, we would have avoided, the loss of life for Afghans, for international community, for even, the United States and many other countries that had deployed their forces. But we have to also remember that Afghanistan was a fairly functioning country before the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. in that region. And what happened as a result of that invasion and the Cold War, interest that the Americans had at that time by arming, the Mujahideen, by really, turning an entire generation into fighters and radicalizing that to bleed the Russians in Afghanistan. The 90s, would have required a robust engagement from the United States and the international community. And part of my research for my thesis at Middlebury College in the US, I looked at this, and many scholars had argued that it would have been probably between 2 to 3 billion US dollars in the 1990s to revive the rural economy, to revive the agriculture economy in the 1990s. But the American administration at that time was not interested. And what happened, there was this sort of prevalent thinking, well, we don't care about Afghanistan or any other country far away. But what the reality of the world was that you lived in a world of countries being so interconnected, the common dangers and interests. And Afghanistan soon started, posing a threat. Look at the opium issue in Afghanistan, even today under the Taliban. You have another bumper crop. Look at all the problems. So in my dream scenario as an Afghan, I would have wanted the Americans in 2002 and 3 and everyone else, including the Afghan leadership that miserably failed, to say, okay, let's make sure that we have a sustainable peace process. Let's make sure that we have an Afghanistan that can become a committed member of the international community. Let's make sure that Afghanistan can turn its resources and location in that part of the world, into its own benefit. But I think it is also true to say that Afghanistan lives in a bad neighborhood. We're not blessed by nice, geopolitical realities, whether you talk about Pakistan and Iran and Russia and so on and so forth. So I would have hoped that there would have been that convergence of interest, in the region between the Americans, the regional countries, and Afghanistan, and we could have turned, Afghanistan into a success story. What has now happened, despite all the blood and treasure, you can't even imagine how much money has been spent in Afghanistan. Afghanistan still faces rest. It is an actual country, resources, including water, but don't have a loaf of bread. And I think that, in my view, is what failure looks like. It's a monumental failure on everyone's part over the last 20 years, which is why I think it's imperative that you have a 9/11 style commission report, something similar to that, to find out exactly what happened, how the state crumbled, because the American people, the Afghan people, everyone who was invested deserves to know what happened to their taxpayers' money. The cost was simply too much, more than blood and treasure.
Thank you. Thank you. We're going to shift gears a bit because I know what's going on today is extremely important, but your experiences are related to all this. It's relatively clear that any peace settlement in Ukraine will be based in part on assurances that Ukraine not join NATO. Further, many experts join the international peace movement in calling for a stop to NATO expansion, some calling for rethinking NATO's existence entirely, in an attempt to reduce the chances of apocalyptic nuclear conflict in the future. What are your views on NATO expansion and how to reduce the chances of nuclear conflict in general?
Well, this is complicated. In the 1990s, there was a debate about whether or not NATO expansion would be provocative, and the Russians indicated their discomfort with that. And I think that horse is out of the barn. Vladimir Putin's regime is highly militaristic and militarized. And I believe that we're in a moment when it would be a mistake to dismantle NATO. But what's going to happen, unfortunately, is that even though NATO military spending is actually, even though people tell us it's not that high, it is actually quite high. And US military spending is quite high. What we'll see, and Germany's already done this, is an increase in military spending by the other members of NATO besides the US and Germany. And I think that that may not be necessary. It may, in fact, be counterproductive. It may simply be wasteful. But the other part of your question is about nuclear weapons. I believe that it's important that we take the Russian waiving of the nuclear threat seriously as a reminder that we've got thousands of nuclear weapons remaining in the world and that they should be dismantled through an arms control process, and that material, the fissile material, the weapons, should be dismantled. And I believe that there is some renewed interest in the United States in arms control as a result. I think there's a greater understanding on the part of the American people about what nuclear use would mean. And this may, put the wind under the sails of those who've been advocating a return to nuclear weapons arms control. Other weapons of mass destruction should be dealt with as well. I however, don't think that this is a regime that the Russian regime will respond well to NATO dismantling itself, because they'll just see that as force works, threats work. And what you don't want to give an aggressor is grist for their mill, in some cases delusional mill, that force is effective. And in other words, you have to stand up to this particular bully.
Bilal, any comments on NATO? NATO was also active in Afghanistan at the time.
Well, I think as an Afghan, I would like to draw some comparisons. We lived in that period of hope and fear, 2014 onwards. We were often told by, the American officials and NATO and European officials that Afghanistan will not be abandoned, that NATO will not leave, that these forces will continue to stay there. And in some ways, I feel that, the Ukrainian people in the Ukrainian government were abandoned by the United States of America and everyone else, especially when you don't have a no-fly zone. I mean, this is what friendship in war should and must look like. So from my own experience, looking at Ukraine, I feel like the United States of America has a global credibility gap that is only expanding, because it will have massive consequences for the US national security and for countries to really trust, the US in that sense. And, who knows what country is next on Russia's list. But as an Afghan looking at the Russian invasion of Afghanistan and what's happening in Ukraine, I feel that the real bear trap is Ukraine for the Russians, that they will be stuck there and that there will be cost. And I was looking through some of the documents from the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which documents interviews with former communist generals. And there's quite a lot of mentions that during the Russian invasion, some of the best fighters were from Ukraine, including from Kiev, especially those who overthrew the president and that coup, So that, in that sense, the cost of this war for Russia will be big. And imagine, in an era where there's cell phones and televisions and, in Russia, when coffins go back to Russia, there will be a lot of pressure. Even during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, when Russian soldiers were killed and they were taken back to Russia, it had a massive impact on the morale and psyche of the Soviet army there, because people really started, creating a lot of noise, but obviously probably away from cameras and stuff like that. But overall, I hope that there is a negotiated settlement soon, that both countries can, live in peace, because I don't think anyone can really see how, Ukraine is being destroyed piece by piece, and how the cost of war is too much. And for us, it's heartbreaking, because we have a big community of Afghans in Ukraine who fled Kabul thinking they will be safe there, or Afghans who have invested in business, and it's simply heartbreaking.
Yes, I'll move into some of the questions from the audience that relate. There's a question from Jason Williams, and he asks, how can diplomacy be advocated in Ukraine to demilitarize the tensions between US and Russia?
Well, this war has to end before there's demilitarization. I think that's the first step. And the war will end through, unless Russia turns Ukraine into rubble, the war will end through diplomacy. And at that point, the United States and the Russians and other countries will have to talk about consequences for Russia that go beyond those that have already been imposed, and then trying to not have, though, punishment of this aggressive war be such that it sets up the seeds for the next war. In other words, it can't be too punitive. I think that we lost a lot of ground in terms of the opportunity to denuclearize and demilitarize Central Europe in the 1990s and after the 9/11 wars. And in addition, the Trump administration got out of multilateral agreements, including ones with Russia, and that is a setback. So we've got to go back to the negotiating table in many venues.
Okay, and there's another related question. Nasser Al-Baqal on our Zoom call has written, I've heard Vladimir Putin say that Russia is a world power, in quotes, and has a right to preemptively attack nations. Where does this mentality come from? Drawing earlier to Professor Crawford, your definitions and your points about militarism. How would you answer that?
Well, this is what the Germans argued in the middle of the 20th century, and in fact, the early part of the 20th century, when Germany expanded into Southwest Africa and East Africa. They argued that they were late to the imperial game, and they deserved to be considered a great power. And that view lasted and grew under a different regime, the Nazi regime. So we've heard that tune before. I'm not saying that they're exactly the same, but a country that thinks that it has special rights because it has a large military and wants to throw that weight around is dangerous. And on the other hand, Russia is not a great power. They are, I would say, a peripheral economic power. They mostly get their revenue from exports of oil and natural gas. And in other words, they're a primary product producer. And that revenue will decline as the United States moves away from fossil fuels. And that's a good thing. The Russian economy will be in even worse shape after this war, not only because of the loss of external investment, but because of the loss of a generation, perhaps, we don't know how many, of individuals who will be injured and killed in this fighting. And this is a tragedy for the Russian people.
How is this posturing of Russia as a great power and the right to preemptive attacks any different from the US's posturing after 9/11?
It's not. Look, if you read the Melian dialogue, the first, I teach international relations, and the first book that we claim as a book about international relations is Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. And in that, there's a point when Athens goes to the island of Milos and says, look, we're a great power and you should give up your autonomy and ally with us. And might makes right, essentially, is their argument. And the Melians resist. Ultimately, they make a moral argument against this might makes right mentality. Now, they're crushed. Most of the people there are killed and the rest are sold into slaves. We don't live in a world right now where we want that to happen. And there are countries which will react. But I agree with the assertion that these are of the same sort. These arguments are similar. They're very familiar. Great powers have made them for thousands of years. And these are militarist beliefs.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Another question here, in any negotiations with Russia, must concessions be made by NATO and America due to them being more powerful and have more to give up? This is assuming that Russia has less to give up here. Must concessions be made by NATO and America due to them being more powerful and have more to lose, I should say?
Negotiations usually involve an exchange of things that people value. Unless this, this could go very, very badly for Russia. The analogy with Afghanistan is apt. When the Soviet Union went into Afghanistan, of course, like every militarist power, they thought it'd be quick, easy. They could just sort of do what they would. And what the Russians are doing, making the same mistake. But they may resort to means that are horrific and end the war sooner than the war in Afghanistan ended. But in any setting that's a negotiated solution, something will have to be given by both sides or all sides, and every party should be there. The Ukrainians should be at the table, of course, not like the way we ended the war in Afghanistan, where the Afghan government was not at the negotiating table, with the Taliban and the United States and the other Western powers.
This is a really interesting question coming from someone in their group, didn't name themselves. How can the people of a militarized society, reverse the path if the regular democratic avenues are more and more copied and less available? How can the people of militarized society reverse the path if the regular democratic avenues are less available? I think this goes back to, Professor Crawford, your points about the war and democracy being normative opposites.
Right. I think that everything we do in a society like ours, and in every society, which increases the capacity of individuals to participate in their own governance, in deliberation, in questioning, thinking clearly about all sorts of policies, is something that builds the potential to challenge militarized beliefs. Secondly, everything we do to educate our young people about American history, US history, or any democracy's history is useful, in that you realize certain themes recur, certain mistakes are made again and again, unless the society pushes back. So an educated citizenry is essential to the preservation of democracy. These are things we know, we just have to do them. And unfortunately, I think, there are some in the United States who don't want to look critically at American history, military and otherwise. And this is because it conflicts with their idea and their ideal of what it means to be a US citizen or an American. And I'm sorry, you'll have to get over that and recognize that this is a complicated history, and we have good and we've got terrible, bad, and we'll be stronger if we face that. And then I think, thirdly, we need to be educated as and act through direct action sometimes, right? Using nonviolent resistance and bystander intervention. And those tools are very important because they help people stand up against beliefs that should be challenged. So if everybody in Congress is saying, oh, we must go to war, and only one member of Congress, Barbara Lee, says, no, I won't vote for war, she's an upstander. She's standing for her principles. We need people with the courage of their convictions. And that kind of moral courage comes, I think, from training in nonviolent direct action and how to be an upstander.
Yes, and this leads into our next question for both of you. Can the panelists speak to from Tanya Bahu, who is a professor in our gender studies department here at San Jose State, can the panelists speak to the role of women in the war on terror as civilians, soldiers, or peace builders, both in the US and in Afghanistan or Iraq? I always think of Condoleezza Rice as a particularly interesting figure in all of this, so we can think of on all sides. Bilal, would you like to go?
Yeah, I think we had an amazing number of Afghan women, especially during the last 10 years. I can think of Shahrzad Akbar, young, barely in her 30s. She was leading the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission. And I certainly feel that people like Shahrzad Akbar felt, the 40 years of Afghanistan, the burden on their shoulders, but such was the responsibility. And she was, carrying the dreams of millions of young Afghans, especially women, on her shoulders. And it broke my heart tonight to not see her on the negotiating table as much as I should have seen her. And yes, she came with the former President Ashraf Ghani to the White House, but it is people like Shahrzad Akbar, it's many other fearless, brave, young Afghan women and men today in Afghanistan demanding their basic rights from the Taliban that are the hope for Afghanistan's future. And the sacrifices for the Afghan women over the last 20 years were massive. We would not be where we are had it not been for some women standing up, to self-immolation in Herat or to forced marriages in Daikundi and elsewhere. And I feel that over the last 20 years, the Afghan women did not have the power in the government or in the decision-making that they should have had. So whatever they ended up with as peacemakers, people like Fawzia Kofi and Fatima Gilani and many others, that was because of the sheer, power of their own personalities and their own standings, which often was very risky. So I hope now that we are trying to restart this failed peace process at some stage, which I hope we will be able to do that. Such Afghan women should have the lead and Afghan women should speak for themselves, and speak for other Afghan women. At least that is my hope, and that is what I have observed in the case of Afghanistan.
Professor Crawford, one of the reasons the war in Afghanistan was predicated on saving Afghan women from the Taliban, from Afghan men. And is there a relation to your conception of militarism here by using certain populations as a peg?
Yeah, I think that's about heroic narratives. And, we talk about soldiers as exemplars of heroic action. And the United States had a heroic narrative about, remaking Afghanistan, saving women from, horrific fates. And I think that this rationale sort of came later, and it was, I'm not sure how genuine that was on the part of the administration. They had one military objective, which was to get Osama bin Laden and make sure that the fighters in Al-Qaeda couldn't pose a threat to the United States. They likely did do that. Unfortunately, it provoked a backlash. The other, that is, and that Bilal has already described it, the other objectives, I think, came late, and they were about development and being, masculine heroes.
There's a related question here as we're kind of going back to 9/11. It says, from Zara Aden, who's one of our students, despite the cost, do you think the US achieved its objective of preventing similar 9/11 attacks? Or do you think it has put our security at risk?
Well, I tend to think that much of what the US did in terms of homeland security may have been more useful than going abroad to slay those particular dragons. And what I mean by that is increased airport security, inspecting packages, inspecting containers as they come into the United States, technology to look for dirty bombs, all of that, which was done, with homeland security, has been more useful. Changing changing behaviors and hardening certain sites has been more useful, I think, than going abroad. Now, but there's the other part of the question, which is, did it put the US security at risk? I think when the United States or any country kills civilians inadvertently or deliberately, and both sometimes, it creates ill will. And that ill will, we've already seen, has radicalized individuals in the United States who already live here, and it has radicalized others abroad. I mean, we've seen that for the last 20 years, that people use the occasion of civilian harm as a rationalization for their own violence, which almost inevitably harms other civilians. So this is a nasty spiral, and I hope we can break out of it. There were other ways to protect the United States. Some of them were used by Homeland Security, and I think that those have been largely effective.
And Bilal, from your research in looking at ISIS Khorasan in Afghanistan, the resurgence of ISIS in now its battle with the Taliban, do you think that there are threats, growing threats in Afghanistan currently and after the US withdrawal in August that pose risks to the US?
Well, the Islamic State in Khorasan, or ISKP as is the Afghan branch, has been actually in recruiting mood, recruiting from within the Taliban, especially the Uzbek and Tajik Taliban in the north, as well as recruiting from former members of the Afghan National Security Forces. That number is disputed, but it is safe to say that they have done that recruitment. From where I come from in the east of the country, from my own home province of Kunar, over the last 4 or 5 years, we had multiple examples of people that I knew, for example, that I could identify who had traveled to places like Syria and Iraq. So there was definitely that connection and expertise, and people from India, for example, from Kerala and many other foreign nationals would end up with Islamic State in eastern Afghanistan and elsewhere. But what is even more complex as a reality is the generational, historical, and ideological relationship that the Taliban have with Al-Qaeda. That relationship is quite deep. When you take Afghanistan's interior minister for the Taliban, Sirajuddin Haqqani, who has a bounty of 10 million on his head, he is now someone who has had, and his family has had that relationship. The Haqqanis allowed suicide attackers in the 80s, as far as, the Soviet invasion back then. And although he's come out now giving a public speech for the first time, it has always been that promise that the Taliban have said that, look, we will cut ties with Al-Qaeda, that we will not allow safe haven. But the reality is that you're talking about several thousands of these foreign fighters, especially from Central Asian countries. And they have been, fighting side by side, having even intermarriages. How can the Taliban take them over at any stage? That relationship is simply too deep, and we should not just take the Taliban's word for it. We know that the risk is far more greater to the region at the moment. If you look at Pakistan, since the Taliban have taken over, there's like 100 and something% increase in attacks. And suddenly the Pakistani government is asking the Taliban, you need to crack down on Pakistani Taliban inside Afghanistan. And the Taliban have failed to deliver on that promise. Similarly with Iran, with Central Asian countries. And it is that risk to the region. Look at the attack that happened in India, the Mumbai attack, or the tragic truck bomb that took place in the Serena Hotel in Pakistan many years ago and elsewhere. So I have a feeling that it might be the region that might react to Afghanistan, and they might have some sort of an intervention. Then the international community, the United States, that might happen at a later stage. And I also have a feeling that we might see the repeat of a sad and tragic Syria type situation of many of these regional countries coming in, Iran and Russia and elsewhere, and they're saying, well, hold on, there's a threat to us. So the Taliban at the moment are trying to convince the region on those points, but definitely the relationship has been deep over the last 20 years. What I followed was Al-Qaeda teaching the Taliban to carry out truck bombs and suicide attacks. We remember in 2002, there was a suicide attacker in the famous Chicken Street in Kabul city who failed to blow himself up. He tried to detonate, and because the Taliban didn't have that expertise, but then soon we saw the so-called Iraqization of the Afghan insurgency, the use of roadside bombs, which posed a major threat to everyday life, often killing civilians heading for funerals or weddings, And in my view, the Taliban would have to do a more transparent, a better job trying to convince everyone that they have changed, that they will not pose a threat. Remember, the Taliban today control all the airports, all the borders. They have Black Hawk helicopters. They have, they are in total control of 21st century military hardware, from night vision goggles finding its way to Kashmir by jihadi groups to many other concerns. So, fingers crossed that there's no threat from the Taliban or from Afghanistan, but it is on the Taliban to prove everyone else wrong on those points.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a very good point, that a lot of the military equipment is still there. That some were destroyed, but the Taliban do have these technologies in hand now that they didn't in the 90s. And also, I'll add a few points about the combination of the rushed withdrawal by the United States and Afghanistan, the current humanitarian disaster, and as Bilal is pointing out, the relationship between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban leadership that goes back decades could, in answering the question for this audience member, may still put us at risk. And so I don't think all that money spent has been useful in mitigating the 9/11 style risks. I'm going to move on a bit to more how militarism comes back to the United States, how every war that is fought has, as a couple scholars have mentioned, has a boomerang effect, comes back. And there's a question here that says, I can't help but relate this conception of militarism and militarization to policing in the US. I've read books that put forth the idea that counterinsurgency is policing and vice versa. I'm curious about your thoughts on militarism and domestic policing.
I think that's an apt observation. I mean, there are several scholars who've looked at two parts to this. First, the police in the US have a disproportionate share of their force who are veterans or are still or active in the reserves. And the police say that this is because they have similar values, and this is true. And that's unfortunately, though, some of those values about force, kill or be killed, have become, in some situations, I believe, dominant. And there is this sort of warrior cop, and that's what they call it, warrior cop mentality and warrior cop training, which some, even in Minnesota, still talk about. Now, I think that's one way that militarism comes home. I think it also comes home in terms of the physical equipment that we know that police get excess military equipment, including night vision goggles, including armored vehicles, and some of that equipment is used for, essentially what is the equivalent of a night raid, which is a no-knock warrant. And I think that these tactics and equipment lead to a more militarized police force. There's also the notion that some of the attitudes are similar in that, there's this concern that if we decrease the police budget, we're asking for trouble. And the sort of allergic reaction to cuts in policing, is, I think, about the same view that force is effective, that you need to have force, and that it's not counterproductive. So I see lots of parallels. And in fact, the military have been, engaged in training other countries' police. So we see these not just in the United States, but in other places. And our US police have gone on to train the US military in certain scenarios. So it's a two-way street.
Some of the other questions that are coming on, I think Bilal stepped away for a minute. This is important, by Jordan Wyndham on our call. Do you think it is possible for Americans to regain some of the individual rights we gave up in the name of national security during the war on terrorism?
I think so. I think some of these, I think so. Yes, some of the surveillance may be clawed back. But I'm actually not an expert on this, and I think that the most important thing we can do in terms of our civil liberties and rights is to work to make sure our democracy is robust, and then to tell our legislators that when they take away our capacity to have information, to challenge the government, or to surveil us, give that we want sunset clauses on these, and that they cannot be permanent. And I think that we've learned that you need sunset clauses, and if necessary, some things can be renewed, but you cannot have what is essentially in some ways a permanent state of emergency be something that goes on in perpetuity.
Right. That's important point. I want to also just jump back a little bit to Bilal's experience. There's a question here about the United States makes mistakes in wars that repeat again and again. Why do you think they don't learn from their mistakes and work on improving their strategies in the future rather than just accept making the same mistakes over and over again? And before we get to that answer to that, I wanted to use that to set up. Bilal, you were embedded with the Afghan military, and I think also with the U.S. military numerous times. It'd be really interesting if you talk a little bit about the things that you saw that perhaps relate to this question of the kinds of mistakes that were made in those theaters of war in Afghanistan that you were part of.
I was actually extremely lucky because I had deep access to the younger generation of Afghan military leadership. And through that, I also actually happened to have had some access to the Americans, who are on those bases, as well as doing a couple of embeds with them. One of the biggest problems that I encountered from the very get-go, actually all the way up to 2021 when I was in Helmand, was this issue of lack of credible intelligence. It was always someone at a village district level trying to use the Afghan government or the Americans, or for that reason, the Taliban, to settle an old score. And it was tragic that despite 20 years, we continuously made that mistake, whether it was bombing village parties or it was carrying a night raid, it sort of never improved. But these were also real risks, no matter what sort of intelligence you had. If you had to bomb a village or if you had to carry a night raid, the risks were real. And one of the things that I came to do, slightly different from your question, was investigating war crimes by certain Australian soldiers. I was asked by the Australian TV to go and investigate that. And in the beginning, it was just one case that we were looking at. Forget about all the Western investigations and institutions involved. And once I went in, I realized that actually there were nearly 40 people that were killed in various attacks. And obviously, a lot of amazing people in Australia worked on that, and we documented all of those. So one of the things that we need to remind ourselves is a lot of war crimes have happened in Afghanistan over the last 20 years that we don't know about, that needs a good amount of work, not only involving international forces and the Afghan forces, but also the Taliban. And the issue of trying to make sure that you do justice is really not an option for many Afghans, because when you talk about these mistakes or these airstrikes or the Taliban bringing a truck with 5 tons of military-grade explosives or potent explosives and detonating it in the heart of Kabul or in the heart of another district or a provincial capital, we are yet to hear, about a process that will address those issues. But overall, it is also true that whenever you're embedded, no matter where you're embedded and no matter what sort of access you have, you only have a view limited to that place because you're not in touch with people. As a journalist, you can't spend the night in a village. You can't go on a highway. You can't ask a truck driver how he feels, about roadside bombs or a drone flying over area. So unfortunately, my ability to talk to the Afghan people was greatly limited over the last 8-9 years, and I took risks, from time to time. Once I had my daughter, I started getting very reluctant to basically make those journeys. But mistakes after mistakes after mistakes. And 20 years is a long, long time. We should have had more and more Americans able to speak Pashto and Dari, two of the languages, among many others. But I hardly encountered anyone within the American embassy or government who could speak that, any of those languages. And that alone tells you how big a failure that cultural gap, was.
Yes, and those language barriers were huge problems for the American military because they were fed misinformation. They were fed wrong information, and which affected their strategy and the way that they carried out their operations.
And if I could just quickly add something, I have to make a little bit of a gesture to explain that memory better. In Kandahar, I remember one time I was embedded with the Marines, and they were trying to tell Afghans to stop, like this, And usually in Afghanistan, when you do this, it's a sign for hello. It can be interpreted as that. And I saw that firsthand outside of the city of Kandahar, So I feel that cultural advisors and translators that the United States government and army had were either people who didn't have good command of the local languages and the cultural sensitivities, or they were simply people who had lived for too long outside of Afghanistan. And that actually presented a big problem, not only for the American military, but I think for other international forces as well.
Thank you. Professor Crawford, anything on why the US continues to make the same mistakes over and over again in these wars?
Well, I think it's in part because it's the case that we keep thinking this is the first time we've done a counterinsurgency. So for instance, in the Philippines in 1899, 1900, people argued, well, this is the first time we've done a counterinsurgency. But of course, everybody there in the Philippines who was in command had been in the Indian Wars. And those, they took their lessons from there, but they also took the mistakes from there. And they took the racism to that location. And the United States committed atrocities in the Philippines in that war and occupation. And there's a great title of a book called Learning to Forget, which talks about the failure to get lessons from things like the Philippine occupation or the Vietnam War. And then occasionally there's a military officer who will look at those wars and say, well, we must remember the lessons from the Indian Wars and the Philippines and Vietnam, and that is to make friends. And so then we get a doctrine that says it's population centric, which is really hearts and minds, which is really, conquest with kindness, from the 19th century. So they keep recycling the doctrines with new names and the practices. And I think, for example, you can look at the reservation system Native Americans put into reservations. That was part of the hearts and minds strategy, which they called conquest with kindness. Then it was translated into in the Philippines into protected zones, which were really just reservations, and anybody outside the protected zone could be considered a militant and would be killed. The same thing with strategic hamlets. Now, there were no protected zones in Afghanistan and Iraq, but it's the same notion that if you're not with us, you're potentially against us. And I think there's also this lack of understanding of who the people are. I agree completely with Bilal. The agency, the humanity of people in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the 75 to 80 other countries the United States is still engaged in counterterror operations to this day, has been, and is not surprisingly, lost. That's the pattern. But I do believe that what's not just surprising here about this, the failure to learn from mistakes, it's the reinvention of the wheel, the perpetual reinvention of the wheel, not realizing that first time it didn't work so well and it led to atrocity, and it keeps doing so.
And going on to our last question, I'm mindful of the time, and I so appreciate your nuanced answers to these questions. Comes from, I think, one of my students. We're reading the Afghanistan papers by Craig Whitlock, Washington Post reporter, for the class. And she writes, referencing the Afghanistan's paper book I'm reading for my class, why do you believe the government prioritized throwing millions of dollars into the Afghanistan war, but had no effective plan or strategy, which the book really lays out? And then a second part to that is, what is your view on Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld lying to the public about the good process in the war, despite his persistent worries about the war behind the scene? So one is having no effective plan or strategy, and the other is the public face of the US government.
Well, I think one of the things that Craig Whitlock seems to be rightly incensed about is the persistent failure to tell the American people how both wars were going, but in particular how Afghanistan wasn't going well. And that is not, sadly, not unique to this war. The same thing occurred in Vietnam. And that's what the Pentagon paper showed us. And that's why Whitlock is calling these the Afghanistan papers. There's a real serious echo here. It's not unusual at all for there to be rosy, presentations by generals and secretaries of defense. And I think the problem is when those rosy views are not only given to the public, but they're given to political leaders, and then they continue doing the same thing. Oh, just a little bit more bombing. Oh, just a little bit more money, and we can win this war. And we're almost there. And another increment of effort, and we'll achieve victory. That is a militarist fallacy. And it's also the tendency of people who are afraid, as they were afraid to give President Johnson the bad news about Vietnam, people who are afraid to speak up. And that, again, is a problem with a democracy where you don't have people who are capable or willing to speak up. So there's a lot to that question, and I really appreciate it.
And Bilal, on that same question, you were on the other side doing reports, writing reports for news organizations and BBC and different news organizations, taking in the press releases from CENTCOM and from different military leaders in how the war is going from the US side, but you're seeing something different on the ground. What is your take on that?
To be honest with you, I was not a great fan of statements either from the US government, from the Afghan government, or the Taliban, because the statements to me did not resonate with the realities and facts on the ground. And, one of my earlier on challenges, what was that? There was this report, there was that report, the period between 2002 and 2008 and 9. But then, we had editors, both at the BBC, where I worked for 14 years, who were constantly just asking us to go out and find out rather than just read, from a piece of paper. But the deep disconnect between the American embassy in Kabul and the Afghan people, to me, was very visible, because for example, I had studied in the US. I had gone to one of the best colleges and was one of the main reporters. I probably went twice to some function at the US Embassy. It was very limited, the scope of their outreach. And a lot of these Western diplomats were often behind blast walls along with the Afghan officials and government officials. So there was a major barrier between them and the people. And interestingly enough, from 2014 onwards, it was the US military or part of the US military that were more active. They had various officials who are reaching out to people actively, taking risks, leaving the NATO ISAF headquarters. And to me, that was a big surprise that instead of the US diplomats, it was, the military folks and the guys. And some of them were very open, like when you saw pictures of the US general popping up on Twitter or Facebook account of some Afghan official or warlord or strongman. And the fact that this was happening in Kabul, the fact that the US diplomats could not leave the embassy for like a kilometer, I think says it all, says all about the disconnect. And we also saw that on August the 15th and before that, when Chinook helicopters were flying nonstop, 24/7 for a few days, literally like, taking Western citizens and those Afghans with passports for a ride, which is like only 5 minutes from the US embassy. And the fact that the United States had spent trillions and they had like been in the country for 20 years, along with the international community and the Afghan government, and no one was able to make that short journey to the airport, says it all, and had the word epic failure written on it. And, I was stuck in my home trying to report for the first 3 days when I could. And then I was forced because the Taliban kept knocking on my door in office. But to me, that was the most, visible example of what failure could look like.
Wow, thank you. Thank you both, Bill. Thank you both, Dr. Crawford and Bilal John.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. I just want to jump in now, first of all, to hopefully have our audience and everyone join me in thanking our panelists for today, Professor Crawford and journalist Bilal Sarwari. This has been an incredible conversation. Our audience has been very, very engaged in the chat and in the Q&A. We had everybody kind of stuck around for the whole webinar, and that's usually a very good sign in terms of the engagement of the conversation. And so we want to thank you very much for spending this time with us. We know you're both very busy. We know you're both doing incredibly difficult and important work right now. And so we just want to thank you from the Institute and from the university and from our students and audience for spending this time with us. We very much appreciate it. I also want to share with you all and with our audience, you may have noticed that Congressman Ro Khanna did not join us today. As you can imagine, he had to cancel actually this morning due to congressional votes that were happening this afternoon and the related talks with Ukrainians for obvious reasons. And so he apologized. He wanted me to pass on his apologies to you all as panelists, to our audience, and to the rest of us as hosts. We're going to try and get Congressman Khanna back for a future event sometime soon. So thank you very much for your patience with all of that. He thanks you for your patience as well. Finally, I wanted to plug one more time. We have a follow-up event in our lecture series happening this coming Friday. I'm going to put the chat link or the link in the chat right now. So we're posting the flyer, as you can see. So this is going to be a focused discussion with our guest from Princeton University on the understanding and reducing the growing danger of nuclear weapons. This relates directly to our previous conversation today regarding denuclearization and what Professor Crawford talked about in terms of these doors beginning to open again toward moving towards actual weapons control, nuclear weapons control, and disarmament. And so, as you can imagine, we feel like these are very, very incredible conversations for us to engage in right now, all of which touch on these issues of war and peace, but also on some of these larger existential crises. And so we very much hope you'll take this opportunity to register and join us on Friday. Otherwise, and I'm going to put this in the chat as well, please check out our website. Following today, we're going to be posting the video of today's event on our website under the lecture series link. And then we also have a YouTube channel that you can find from our website where you'll be able to find not only this edition of the Human Rights Lecture Series, but our prior lecture series as well. And with that, I want to thank one more time our panelists. I want to thank our amazing host, Halima Kazem. And I want to thank our amazing student assistant, Ariana Shaw, for all of their help with today's event. I lastly want to thank our very hardworking staff at the HRI and at San Jose State for helping us put on these events. Without the help of our admins, without the help of our event staff, these kinds of events would frankly be impossible to put on for you all. And so we are indebted to them, and I hope you join me in thanking them for their time and their effort. And with that, we'll close. I hope everyone has a wonderful day and evening, and I wish everybody the best. Today also being, as one of our audience members mentioned, the anniversary of the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. And so it's perhaps a solemn day for us to be thinking about these issues and the impacts of militarism on civilian populations all over the world. Thank you again, and we hope to see you next time.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. Thank you.